Roth conversions are one of the most talked about strategies in retirement planning. They're often presented as the smart move and often as something everyone should be doing. Whether a Roth conversion makes sense depends on how taxes actually work, how retirement income is structured, and what the real objective of converting is. Today, I'm going to walk through three specific things. First, the tax assumption that drives most Roth conversion advice, and why confusing marginal tax rates with effective tax rates leads people astray. Second, a planning lever that often gets overlooked entirely, but can materially reduce future taxes without converting to a Roth at all. Third, how to think clearly about whether a Roth conversion belongs in your plan, and it's going to be based on trade-offs, not consensus groupthink. And make sure you stay with me to the end, when I'll share one situation where Roth conversions are the best move and why it has nothing to do with saving you taxes. Before going further, let's make sure we're clear on terms. A Roth conversion is when you move money from a tax-deferred IRA into a Roth IRA. The amount that's shifted is treated as ordinary income in that year, and you pay taxes on it at whatever your tax rate is at the time. After certain rules are satisfied, that money can grow and be withdrawn without being taxed again. And that structure is what makes Roth conversions appealing. And it's also where many planning mistakes begin. Most Roth conversion advice starts with one core assumption, that tax rates today are going to be lower than what they will be in the future. And if that's true, it makes sense to pay tax now at a lower rate rather than later at a higher one. But this is where the misunderstanding begins. Marginal tax rates are different from effective tax rates. The mistake I see people make is assuming that, let's say they're in the 22% federal tax bracket, that all of their taxable income is taxed at 22%. That simply isn't the case. The tax code works like a staircase. Only the dollars that land on each step are taxed at that rate. Everything below is taxed at lower rates. And that's why the effective tax rate is more important than the marginal bracket when deciding whether a Roth conversion makes sense. For someone sitting right at the 22% marginal bracket, their effective tax rate is lower. So the real question isn't, what is my tax bracket today? It's, what is my effective tax rate likely to be over the rest of my life? Let me show you how this looks in practice. So this chart shows the estimated effective tax rate of a hypothetical couple who are newly retired. So both of them are age 64. So what you see at the bottom left-hand corner is their ages. And given the makeup of their savings, they don't need to access their IRA or retirement accounts until later. And so as you see here, their effective tax rate is very, very low because in the early years of their retirement, they're just withdrawing from their non-retirement savings. Then as they hit their Social Security ages, part of that is taxable. And then as they move later into retirement, they're taking distributions from their retirement accounts, including mandatory distributions. And that is causing an effective federal tax rate of really no higher than about 12%. That's important to look at simply because, as I had said before, the effective tax rate is typically lower than the marginal tax rate. So if we flip this over to what their federal income tax brackets are over the course of their retirement, it's a very different picture. So at age 64, their income, as low as it is, falls into the 10% bracket. As their income increases, it increases to the 12%. And then when they take their mandatory distributions, it kicks them up into the 22% marginal income tax bracket. But that's not all the dollars that are. It does move them into the 22% tax bracket, but their effective rate, remember, is only going to be around 8%. So much different than 22%. Because like I had said before, the tax code is written like a staircase. Only the dollars on each step are taxed at that tax rate. And in this specific client's case, the dollars that are on the top step, that 22% marginal tax bracket, represent the lower share of the tax dollars they have in those years. Now let's talk about the trade-offs, because this is the part that really matters. The best case scenario for a Roth conversion, if the goal is to reduce lifetime taxes paid, is that the person retires early and lives well beyond life expectancy. The longer you live in retirement, the longer the Roth has the time to earn back the taxes paid on the conversion and continue compounding tax-free. But there's risk here. There's no guarantee that the investments inside the Roth will perform well enough to justify the upfront tax cost. And then there's the worst case scenario. The person does the conversion and dies shortly afterward. In that case, they paid more in taxes than what they would have if they had never converted at all. That's a real risk that needs to be acknowledged. But as you'll see later, there can still be value for heirs even in that worst case scenario. And the point is this: Roth conversions aren't about certainty. They're about trade-offs. And those trade-offs have to be evaluated based upon what we know today, not on predictions that we can't make with confidence. Conventional wisdom says Roth conversions are good because if you pay taxes now at lower rates, you never have to pay them again. Once money is in a Roth, future growth can be accessed tax-free, which can create opportunities later in life to manage income and limit taxes. And that's the core argument. And in theory, it sounds appealing. But there's more going on here than just theory. There's also a fair amount of groupthink in the financial advisory world. Roth conversions get attention. They sound proactive, they sound sophisticated. In other words, they make good marketing pieces. But popular advice is not the same thing as good advice. Before you ever get to the question of converting to a Roth, there's a simpler and even more effective planning lever that needs to be addressed. Write down these 3 words: asset, location, matters. For households with both retirement accounts and non-retirement savings, one strategy is to locate fixed income, like bonds, inside IRAs, while allowing non-IRA accounts to remain invested primarily in stock-based investments. Here's why that matters. Distributions from IRAs are taxed as ordinary income at your marginal tax rate. So if a couple is in the 22% federal bracket, each additional dollar of IRA withdrawal is taxed at 22%. By contrast, stocks are held in a non-IRA account and they're taxed at long-term capital gains rates. Those rates begin at 0%. The first capital gains tax bracket is 0% for single filers with taxable income below $49,450 in year 2026, and that's after all deductions. For married couples, double that number. If gains or qualified dividends fall within those levels, the 0% rate applies, effectively making that income free from federal tax. So instead of continuing to grow a very large IRA that later creates inconvenient required distributions, some households intentionally limit IRA growth by holding lower growth assets in their IRA while allowing stocks to compound in the more tax-efficient non-retirement accounts. And this can be especially useful for people who don't need to live on their IRA and view the required distributions as a taxable inconvenience and not necessarily a necessity. Roth conversions also come with their own set of rules. Each conversion has its own 5-year clock. The earnings on that conversion must remain in the Roth for 5 years, and that's regardless of your age. So be careful if you're later on in life, because if that 5-year clock has not been satisfied, the clock will continue for your heirs. The converted amount can be withdrawn since taxes were already paid in the year of conversion, but the earnings must stay put. That detail gets missed far too often. There's also a common tax return issue that creates real problems. When a Roth conversion is done, the IRA custodian issues a 1099 showing a distribution. If that goes unnoticed during tax preparation, it can show up as a fully taxable distribution. I see this quite frequently when I review tax returns. When a Roth conversion is done, Form 8606 must be attached to that year's return. If you have an accountant prepare your return, you must tell them a Roth conversion was done. Otherwise, they're not likely to know. Finally, aggressive Roth conversions can have long break-even periods. This chart shows the break-even for the same couple that we were looking at in the prior chart if they did Roth conversions up to the 22% federal tax bracket. This is assuming that they're going to live to age 95. And what we're seeing here is that when they do these conversions, they're going to be spending much more in the way of taxes. However, they're going to start the conversions and pay much more taxes earlier on, up to the point where they'll have converted all of their retirement dollars. So conceivably, they don't have any more taxable withdrawals coming from their retirement nest egg, but the total taxes paid is over $500,000. Notice the yellow line. The yellow line is if they just took the taxes as they needed to, and including the mandatory distributions that they had later in life. And the difference between the two is dramatic. So in 2037, where they both turn age 75, if they do this aggressive Roth conversion strategy and effectively have no tax-deferred dollars and can take withdrawals tax-free from Roth accounts for the rest of their lives, they will have paid $554,000 in taxes. If they had not done that type of strategy, at the same point, they'd have paid a cumulative total of about $135,000. And that means their break-even goes all the way out to year 2052, which for each of them is age 90. That's a long time horizon. So anywhere within here, if they pass away before age 90, they'll have paid more in taxes than what they really should have. Let's look at this in a different way. Same conversion strategy, but we're not assuming they live a long life. They live a life to average life expectancy, which in this case is age 86. And looking at the chart here, they don't make it long enough to break even. So, living to life expectancy means that they had paid more taxes than what they would have if they had just taken the mandatory distributions or whatever withdrawals they needed over the course of their retirement. To understand why Roth conversions can make sense as a legacy strategy, you have to start with the truth about retirement accounts. Taxes were always part of the deal with retirement accounts. IRA stands for Individual Retirement Agreement, not account as many people assume. And the agreement works like this. If you get tax deductions for the contributions made during your working years, your money grows tax deferred for decades. And in exchange, those dollars are taxed later in life, presumably when the values are larger. Your retirement accounts were never entirely yours, roughly speaking. Uncle Sam owns about a quarter of them. And that reality becomes even more important when those accounts pass to the next generation. Changes made by the Secure Act redefined how most non-spouse heirs inherit retirement accounts. Today, non-eligible beneficiaries, which is essentially everyone other than a spouse with a few limited exceptions, must fully withdraw inherited retirement accounts by the 10th anniversary of the original account holder's death. That means tax-deferred IRAs can significantly impact the tax picture of the people inheriting them, especially if that 10-year window falls during the heir's peak earnings and highest tax years. This is where the Roth conversion as a legacy plan can be valuable. Heirs still must withdraw all the funds from an inherited Roth IRA within that same 10-year window, but there's a critical difference. They don't have to pay any taxes on those withdrawals. All else being equal, they can allow the money to grow tax-free for up to 10 more years and then withdraw it all with no federal tax consequence. Once the money is withdrawn, the tax benefit ends, but at least the IRS didn't take a large bite on the way out. Roth conversions are a tool, and like any tool, they only work when used for the right purpose. They're not to be treated as automatic, and they're certainly not a universal benefit to everyone. And they're not guaranteed wins either. That's why Roth conversions should always be evaluated carefully in the context of your income needs, your tax reality, and your long-term goals, and always with a qualified tax professional. Good advice is based on knowing the facts.